Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's reading. As a reminder, this shouldn't be a problem given that we're doing it as a webinar, but please keep your microphones muted at all times. But remember that you can and should post questions, thoughts, and insights in the chat section at any time, especially toward the end, because this will all be followed up by a Q&A session with Michael Mejia. My name is Dr. Will Donnelly, and I want to start by thanking everyone so much for coming here tonight, for logging in anyway, for this spring's David James Poissant Endowed Creative Prose Series reading. This series wouldn't be possible without the generous support of people like you, and thank you so much to those of you who've donated already to help make this a reality. If you haven't donated yet, please consider speaking either to me or Dr. Sandy Meek or Dr. Clint Peters about making a donation in the future. If you're a student and you're hoping to receive CE or cultural events credit for attending this event, please be certain to register your Zoom account with your Berry College email address or to log in using your Berry College email address. These Zoom IDs have been offered to all Berry students, and it will be the only way that we can track and then follow up on your attendance. If we don't have your Berry email address, we can't award you CE credit for attending tonight. Near the very end of this reading, you'll be asked also to respond to a very brief survey, very brief, just within the next day or so. And upon satisfactory completion of your response, you will receive CE credit. And now, I'd like to introduce tonight's introducer, Satoria Tomberlin. Satoria is a poet and writer originally from South Georgia. Her work has appeared in Fairy Tale Review, McSweeney's, and various other publications. She graduated in 2010 with a BA in creative writing from here at Berry. Her concentration was in poetry, but she did take classes with tonight's reader, Michael Mejia, as well, who was teaching at Berry at the time. So please help me to welcome Satoria Tomberlin.
Hello, thank you for that introduction, Dr. Donnelly. And thank you everyone for attending this event virtually from the comfort of wherever you are. As many of you already know, Michael Mejia was an associate professor at Berry from 2004 to 2012. And yes, I can personally attest his classes were a pleasure to attend. His work has appeared in various journals and anthologies, including My Mother, She Killed Me, My Father, He Ate Me, 40 New Fairy Tales, and Brothers and Beasts, an anthology of men on fairy tales. Forgetfulness, his first novel, was published in 2005. A critic described it as at once intoxicating and starkly lucid, avant-garde and deeply lyrical, cleverly calculated and fiercely loving. In 2018, he published his second novel, Tokyo, which the Georgia Review called provocative, inventive, and haunting. And just as a side note, that book is available for sale at the shipyard at Berry College for anyone interested. Professor Mejia is the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as the Ludwig Vogelstein Foundation. He is the editor-in-chief of Western Humanities Review and the co-founding editor of Ninebark Press. He is also a reviewer for Sundance Film Festival held in Salt Lake City, Utah. He currently teaches at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, where he lives with his lovely wife, Mindy, and their adorable Jack Russell Terrier, Atticus. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Mejia.
Thank you so much, Satoria, for that lovely introduction. It's great to see you and to know more about what you're up to now. Roll Tide, as we say. And just quick thanks to Will and Sandy and Clint for putting this together. Just like super sad that I can't be there in person, because it would be lovely to see all the people that I'm pretty certain are out there in the audience. I wish I could see your faces. And thanks to Reagan Peluso for the awesome digital poster. That is really, really awesome image. So I really appreciate it. And then, of course, thanks to everybody for tuning in. I would say being here, but tuning in tonight. And again, this is like such a great homecoming, and I so appreciate the opportunity to be able to do this. We miss you. So I'm going to read for about 40 minutes. I'm going to read from my latest novel, Tokyo, that Satoria mentioned, and then I'm going to finish up with some new work. So Tokyo didn't start as a novel. It was really, began with a kind of a standalone novella had a very long title, The Report of Ito Sadahara, head of Tuna Uokai Limited, to the Ministry of Commerce regarding recent events in the domestic fishing industry. And it was published in the journal Agni. And it was really kind of inspired by this National Geographic article that I happened across about the Tokyo fish market, where I had never been before. I was fascinated by the images and by, the turnabout life that was described in that article for the tens of thousands of workers at Tsukiji. It's the largest fish market in the world, and the work mainly happens during the night, from 6 p.m. to about noon the next morning next day when the market closes. And I was just sort of fascinated by the idea that these all these people live this sort of night life, kind of against the grain of the rest of the city and suburbs that their job is to feed. And so I started working with that idea and developed this report, a first-person report written by purportedly a Japanese administrator, Ito Sadahara, who is married to a Japanese American woman named Sato. There's tension between the two of them because of this sort of backward life that they live. And they, at the time that the work starts, Sato has returned to America. They've separated, and Ito has just found out that his wife is pregnant. He has suspicions that she's been cheating on him. Right about that point, when he's kind of like sort of dealing with this personal crisis, he's called to the market to address what appears to be a very serious situation that he doesn't know anything about yet. And that's where I'm going to start the reading. So this is from the report of Ito Sadahara. Saburo and I entered the Tokyo Central Wholesale Market at approximately 7:45 on the morning of 21st April. Tsukiji was hurtling toward the final half of its day. Bicyclists and tares careened through the crowd, the men and the machines all seeming to balance equally great numbers of cages, crates, and boxes. Cranes groaned on the docks, loading and unloading hauls of flash-frozen fish from every sea, lake, river, pond, bay, and ocean around the world. Redfish and Atlantic cod, albacore, fugu, king and queen mackerel, flounder, swordfish, shark and salmon, herring, roughy, walleye, pollock, tuna. Lights flashed and sirens wailed. Engines and hydraulic systems hummed, creaked, and whined through their business, their sounds so in harmony with the human pandemonium that it seemed every object, every person, every breeze blowing ripples through the market's bright banners was somehow driven by the operations of a vast and covert system of flywheels, pistons, and spinning shafts. The grandeur of this spectacle made me forget Sato for the moment, as well as the bother of having to leave my office. Tsukiji swirled around me, spread itself open before me, a voluptuous garden, solicitous, overripe with fish, meat, and produce, with the scent of 2,000 flowers, with humanity, buyers and sellers, the seemingly innumerable rows of stalls and tables and stands and workers stretching away into the distance in every direction. A great organic machine, oblivious to the existence of a larger world, circumscribing it, regulating its systems. There is no air in Tsukiji, minister, only water, and one must learn to breathe it to survive. Salty bay fog and the fresh spray of hoses, mist rising from the defrosting fish, steam from a tea kettle. My socks grew damp as the wet sheen of the cement found its way through the unprotected seams of my soles. A pair of spirited women sifted through bins of beans and mushrooms, while nearby a man shook his head and washed shrimp. And there were younger ones laughing as they chopped the heads off salmon, joking about the previous night's Swallows Bay Stars baseball game. There were buckets of clams and oysters, quivering sardines, tanks of lobsters. From every restaurant came the smell of tempura and yosenabe, oyakudon, and kabayaki. Young boys and women hand-rolled sushi for floor managers reading the newspaper on their break. They were all new men, these managers, a generation or more younger than myself, and I knew I would never know them. There was a time when, at every step through Tsukiji, I would have encountered a friend or an acquaintance. That was only a short while ago. The comings and goings of people in my business, as well as yours, Minister, are infinitely more swift and unambiguous than the fluctuations of the catch. But as quickly as I was delighted by Skiji that morning, I became resentful of it. This beautiful garden I had been admiring as if from a distance, the distance of Uokai's 19th floor, through an autumn haze of nostalgia, was, in fact, as it always had been, a wilderness, unmanaged, writhing and unrestrainable, lacking any sense of moderation, a severely infectious condition that was evident in the afflicted countenances all around me, a condition that was perhaps as much to blame for my loss of Sato as any fickleness in her character or any act of seduction. If it was true, as I believed, that I had been sharing my wife with another man, I could not have been doing so with any equity, and this seemed even more shameful than sharing itself. It is at such moments of despair, Minister, that the most devastating strain of regret sets its teeth in me. There, caught in the market's whirlpool heart, my palm recalled the weight of Sato's breast. My nose knew the scent of her skin. The taste of her body slid across my tongue. Beneath my raincoat, held fast against my ribs by the pressure of my arm, the portrait was still hidden, Sato's portrait that he accidentally walked out with. The frame's sharp edges stabbing me, the cool glass and lacquer giving me a sudden chill through my shirt. For the first time since receiving the news of Sato's collapse, perhaps even since her departure, I felt fully awake, grotesquely aware of myself in the world, this parallel world that I had never known existed. I saw myself reflected in the fishy eye of a convex mirror, alone, foreshortened, shivering in damp ignominy. I needed to get away, out to the street, but when I turned to Saburo, he had disappeared. Looking on every side, I found myself boxed in by stacks of wire cages full of frogs, all heaped upon each other's bloated, filthy bodies, unmoving, indifferent, unblinking, staring out in whichever direction they'd happened to be facing when they were packed for shipment. But for the slight movements of their breathing, I would not have known that they were alive. One particular set of eyes stared out at me. They knew me. Did I cry out at this horror, Minister? I meant to. Indeed, I covered my ears to block out a prolonged and horrific keening that sent the frogs into a panic. I heard my name in their wild croaking and the strange rasping they made as they struggled to escape their fate. Then they were gone, spirited away by a great golden forklift. And again, I heard my name. It was Kimura standing there in front of me, where the frogs had been, Saburo at his side, and though it took me a moment to acknowledge them, they seemed to take no notice of my agitation. The tuna cutter, Grizzly, in his spattered, slimy apron, inclined his head in greeting and motioned for me to follow him to our tuna stall. I obeyed. Though he and Saburo exchanged a few words along the way, neither attempted to brief me further about the tuna affair. 3 or 4 men were at work cutting up a large bluefin when we arrived, and I stopped to observe them. The fish was short but bulky. The healthy red meat of its belly was well marbled and looked particularly valuable. It appeared to be a very good buy, and the sight of it, as well as the air of deference I'd sensed from the workers when I arrived, helped to restore my composure. Indeed, watching the crew dismantle the fish with well-rehearsed ease made me ponder the speed with which chaos may turn to order, dread to tranquility, flesh to food, and vice versa, these seeming oppositions separated only by a thin membrane of circumstance. Unstable, contiguous states we inhabit and abandon by the whim of some force or condition beyond our control, as readily as water turns to ice, turns to vapor, and back again. Is it possible, Minister, that truth too is such a substance, not developing, as we may believe, from blind ignorance toward clarity and understanding, but rather suffering its nature to be more constantly and randomly remade? What was the problem? I asked Kimura finally. This fish looked excellent. He pointed to the back corner of the stall where another, larger fish lay on a low wooden table beneath the makeshift canvas awning. The working men looked up at us, their gaze following the direction of Kimura's silent gesture. They looked back at me, then set to hacking the spine out of the open fish before them. Though I did not know what to make of these glances, they seemed to me more indicative of the seriousness of the situation than anything I had seen or heard thus far that morning. The second tuna was massive, looking to be well over 500 kilos. It would bring a very fine profit if the meat was as good as that of the first. Except for a slight strangeness in its eyes, the fish appeared to have no visible defects. I asked Kimura again, more pointedly, what the problem was, and I let it be known that it irritated me to see such a valuable fish being allowed to sit and stink. Kimura motioned for Saburo and me to stand closer together over the tuna to block the view from the adjoining stalls. Giving me one final glance in preparation, he kneeled and shoved his thick fingers into the tuna, wedging them into the cut he had already made in its belly to have it. Then he lifted. Minister, I do not have the words to describe the mixture of shock, sickness, and amusement I felt at what I saw when Kimura opened that tuna. I say amusement because as my initial horror receded, I was certain, more certain when Saburo had first appeared in my office that morning, that someone was playing a joke. This feeling did not last long. Inside was the body of a woman, naked, gutted, perfectly halved, just like the fish, from crotch to crown. She was not a midget, nor a girl, but a miniature adult female in her late 30s, 40 at the most, fully formed and developed with long black hair, her body perfectly proportioned to fit inside the skin of the fish. The tuna itself had no inner organs, no skeleton. It was apparent that its skin served only as an outer covering for the small woman inside, and that what flesh there was to the fish was only a kind of padding to fill out its shape, so that it, the tuna, gave no sign to either fish or fisherman that it carried a woman inside, that it was anything other than an average bluefin tuna. She was beautiful, Minister. The entire construction was masterful, so much so that it seemed shockingly organic. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the thing, even now I am uncomfortable with the term monster, was the naturalness of the woman's expression of anxious surprise, the slight tension remaining in her muscles, traces of emotions or instincts that seemed both human and less than human, heightening the ambiguity of her origin, her species. I had never seen her before, of course, this small woman, yet her features begged me to recall a name or a similar face, perhaps that of someone I'd encountered once briefly in a crowd or seen on television. My initial physical sickness evolved into a spiritual one. Curiously, this death felt to me like a crime. Are there any others like this? I asked Kimura. There were not. I asked Saburo how much he had paid for it. 563,000, he said. I cannot authorize the disposal of so costly a fish without consulting Senkai-san. I told Kimura and Saburo to wrap up the tuna and lock it in a freezer. It struck the other men not to say a word to anyone. I told Kimura, tell them to say nothing or... But I did not know how to finish. What was the extent of the danger? With what could I threaten them that would keep them from telling even their wives? I turned to watch the men working. None of them spoke or looked up, though I was certain they felt my eyes upon them. It seemed to me that they were all anxiously anticipating the moment later that day when, their work complete, they would pass beyond the borders of Skiji, and perhaps at a supper table, perhaps at a bar, at least one of them would reveal something of our secret catastrophe. Nothing could prevent this. I turned back to Kimura. Just tell them, I said. Tell them to say nothing. So you have to read the rest of the book to find out how that turns out. As Satoria mentioned with my first book, Forgetfulness, it is unusual. My inclination is towards more experimental fiction. And as I thought about what I had done with this project to begin with, I began to sort of question my process of developing what I had, presented as a Japanese voice, however absurd. It was always intended a bit as parody. But I did a lot of research, as I talked with Will's class yesterday, to try and create something like a realistic Tokyo around this, to play against the strangeness of this tuna. And in the subsequent years, I started to think about the process that I went through to sort of create that authenticity, the sort of image of authenticity, and to questions, to some extent, my motives as well, and think about, maybe to sort of put this in the context of a novel that would revisit those images, those attempts at a real sense of Japaneseness of Japan, of Tokyo, where at the time I had never been, um, to sort of like make the rest of the book a kind of questioning of all of that. And that's really sort of what happens in the second and third parts. As I mentioned, I'd never been to Japan when I wrote that, and I subsequently went and spent a month in Japan. I know that's hardly anything at all, really. In Tokyo, I spent several nights wandering around Tsukiji, sort of thinking about, and making notes and taking photographs, and sort of reconsidering the ways in which I had maybe been successful in capturing that place, and also things that I had gotten quite wrong. Like, I mean, nobody's selling flowers in Tsukiji, and in fact, Tsukiji has since closed. Back in 2018, it moved to a site that had been planned for it for decades, really. So I'm going to read a couple of parts from the third part of the book, where you'll probably recognize some characters, perhaps some phrases, some images that I've tried to sort of rework and rethink from different perspectives. It's really sort of the process of the rest of the novel. In this first section, it's kind of my opportunity to give Sato her opportunity to speak. She's sort of disguised here as a character named Yoko, who is the wife of another character named M. And just a couple of notes on what happens there is that in the second and third part of the book, we have a couple of characters who are referred to only by letters, M and S. And S is, resonates with the character of Sadahara, Ito's last name, or his first name, sorry. There is might be Sadahara, might be his son who has the same name, but S is a character who might be male, might be female. Like, it's very ambiguous sort of like object of desire for the character M, who is also very slippery, frequently an American artist, an American actor, an American film director, an American writer, who is married to this character Yoko, also Japanese American. But there's other times when M sort of slips over into potentially a Japanese character. So in a sense, like, M is kind of my opportunity to try and sort of inhabit all these different roles on the page, and again sort of think about like what I was after when I was writing that first piece, and yes, so this is a section where Yoko is recalling a time that she lived in Tokyo when she was married to a character that was very like Ito. He'd sometimes imagined her, Yoko, his wife, in her former life, living in Tokyo, still married to the Japanese, taking the occasional course at Waseda, sitting by the library window one late autumn afternoon, watching the sun set over the western suburbs. What is it? Her friend Yumiko asks, playing with her hair as if distracted, as if it's nothing, natural, as if she isn't aware of the traces of white powder there. She's married too, this woman, her man always coming home late or not at all, even on weekends, working, he says, which means drinking, which is work, Yumiko explains, and betting hostesses and secretaries and taking in the ass from his boss, Takahashi, for all she cares, in some cozy little condo in Shinjuku, while I'm to stay at home and care for his son, another generation of him, so why should I just stand by and take it? Nothing. It's nothing, the woman who is not yet M's wife says. Yoko. Oh, Yoko. She's thinking of the warmth of the hand of the man beside her, another gaijin like her, but Caucasian, like M, who's still not yet in this picture, how the back of that hand might feel against her palm, his open palm on her, his flat, wide wedding ring pressing into her thigh, her neck as he squeezes, and their lips parting, and how they seem to become one as they suck each other's tongues. Such a mysterious flavor, a faraway place that she still recognizes. Oh, it hasn't been so long, really. A lovely memory of home that makes her shudder. I said, aren't you the lucky one? Yumiko eyes the gaijin, who just sits there, smiling, pretending to read, but she isn't talking about him. She means M's wife to be's not yet former husband, the Japanese, the executive, the workaholic. He doesn't drink. There had been a boy once, a beautiful young Japanese, M, not long after she'd arrived, who'd acted so surprised when he realized that she was Sansei, or not Japanese, as he put it. He kept saying it. Oh, but you're not Japanese, as if having to remind himself, as if to excuse her. She'd been eating alone at some place, an izakaya in Shimokita, and he had a girlfriend with him. Wasn't her name Yumiko too? Who had understood English, he said, but wouldn't speak. The girlfriend shook her head when he said that, smiling, and there was something about it, that refusal or compliance, obedience that she didn't like, detested really, something about those two mutually positioning themselves in a hierarchy that she couldn't stomach, learned, taught, embedded in them, evidence, he might have argued, of a cultural necessity, of Japaneseness, that the American, the Sansei, could not understand. But then M, that face, his sense of humor, and so much more dynamic than her husband, the first one, the Japanese, funny and fair-skinned and charming, M, impeccably styled, young, appetizing, consumable. And she could imagine. He'd given her his card as Yumiko, and his Yumiko showed no response to that, just smiling, just normal, just a gesture, the girl might have told herself, just a courtesy, a kindness, her comely young M befriending a woman alone, an older foreign woman, a lonely looking gaijin pretending she's Japanese, her Japanese hair, Japanese mask, that face. But she didn't even know how to eat, did she? The night of the morning of the sarin gas attack, the woman who was not yet M's wife had been home alone again, her husband having already left for his office close to Skiji. She hadn't gone out all day, watching the news, waiting for him to call to check on her. But they'd been arguing again, so she didn't expect. It was that she needed more to do than nothing, to become a full person, more than the mask, the doll, Ningyo, that she'd reduced herself to, had allowed herself to be reduced to, and why. Later, hungry, still alone, she'd walk to the little sushiya by their house, where the owner and his wife always treated her so well, not just because of her husband's reputation, or she didn't think so, but there was no way to know. Where there was no television, of course, just a little recorded music, the sound of a koto, and the chef picking out the best of what he had, but the glistening flesh recalling that young M, what that young M had said that night in Shimokita about Skiji, a fish graveyard, and his impersonation of a dead tuna made them all laugh, and now she couldn't. The flesh lived, pulsed, she was sure of it, and there was the man on the platform, the sarin victim shown over and over. The chef had been gracious about her refusal. The day, he said, she didn't understand what else, but she understood that he understood her lack of appetite. When she got home, she couldn't find M's card, the phone already in her hand in their Western-style bedroom. She was crying. She could imagine, she thought, again that night, with M, she could still, or she could move her hand toward the other one there, beside hers, in the library at Waseda, that other man's hand lying palm down on the table. Positive action, her husband, the Japanese, liked to say. I'm hungry, all of a sudden, she said. Shall we go? So I'm going to jump ahead to, it's hard to know when you're going ahead or back, I guess, to another section on page 184, where we revisit an image that you'll be familiar with, and this sort of returns to this sort of concept of the original novella as a fiction, maybe a fictional film treatment, something that is staged, and this is sort of picking up on that, this character of a detective who arrives a bit too late. The key he'd been given, wrapped in thin blue paper with wisteria blossoms, opened the door, room 2082, just as the note had said it would. A room of shelves crammed tight with books on fish, market histories, poetry, novels, manga, an old wooden desk, and a shabby central table, covered with more volumes, scattered with newspapers and industry magazines. In the back room, the Japanese room, he passed through the tokonoma, through the secret door into the mirrored hall where S. But there's nothing, no one, just the largest tuna the detective has ever seen, lying on its side on the bare concrete floor, lit by a single dangling bulb, light reflecting harshly on the lacquer-like sheen, the defrosting fish's damp surface. Its belly sliced open, revealing fine meat, the severed crescent of its tail shoved up into the gap where its gills once were. A commonplace at Skiji, though in this context it seems like a message, a threat of humiliation. So they'd expected him. But what about S? Had they really brought her here, as she predicted, or was it all a setup? Had she been in on it? He turns in place, scanning his reflections as if one might move independently of him, as if someone might be back there behind any one of them, watching. But what else can he do? He can't ease up. The long time has started. He circles the fish, the floor seeming to suck at the soles of his shoes. His legs feel weak. Who would sacrifice such an enormously profitable specimen like this? Only a clan, of course, a corporate conspiracy, a diverse criminal syndicate with money and influence and nothing to lose. Peering into the fish's upturned, milky eye, he sees nothing unusual. The enormous body, wide enough, long enough to hold a human, carefully folded, knees hugged to chest, as infants once were, the archaeologists say, back in the Jomon period, arranged for burial in clay jars. As the notion blossoms, that characteristic crease familiar to his fans deepens between his thick eyebrows, and he drops to all fours, peering into the fish's open mouth, trying to illuminate that abyss with the faint light of his cell phone, just barely revealing inside another duller sheen, some unnatural object, a solid mass edged with black fur. Or hair? The mime of grief he begins now is exquisite, very Japanese, stamping feet and delicate hand gestures. He extracts a fan from his inside coat pocket, leaving nothing to the imagination but the sound of a koto. After a few minutes, the interpreter is about to step in, but I stop him. Let him finish, I say. He's exploring. Do whatever it is you people do, I told the interpreter to tell the actor earlier. Here is your motivation. And then I recited the line I'd been worrying in my head ever since you last wrote, the line you signed off with, all they'll find in the locker at Kamiyacho is fear and whale meat. The same line spoken, recited by the young man whose call had awakened me last night, my first night in Tokyo, before the line went dead, my Japanese phone. Who was he, and how had he gotten the number, unless you... The interpreter stared at me as he translated, as if maybe I'd misspoken, but the actor accepted my direction without alarm. The crease between his eyebrows suggesting he'd even been anticipating this, as if the line was some kind of code I'd been meant to deliver to him, a code that might permit me entry into, or that he, the actor, was part of this same conspiracy into which I'd been groping my way all along during those nights online, corresponding with you, sinking deeper and deeper into your whirlpool heart. On the flight over, I dreamt us going down in the dark into the black Pacific. How did I survive? And her, my wife, her flight went down too, the two of us taking up residence together again, like Izanami and Izanagi, on a fragment of charred fuselage, planting gardens across an archipelago of flotsam caught in the Pacific Gyre, cultivating radioactive fish and seedlings to feed the new Japan we create through our ritualized rutting, a race in our own likenesses, quite literally, each face, each body, only fractionally different from ours, so that it was near impossible to tell one from. And there, even I somehow have become Japanese, while she looks, as she always has, like one of them. From beneath a red parasol, she speaks, and I understand every word about the process of fermenting indigo leaves into the tsukumo she's made for to dye our hobbies. Or that was a film the Japanese next to me was watching, Kaoru, an accountant making his home in Portland now, headed home to some western suburb for the first time in 6 years, one historical scenario after another he watched, Samurai and Kamikaze, General Nogi and Empress Jingo, all the way from LAX to... Or it was the film I was writing. Or it's this one. What do you think? The interpreter whispers as the detective continues. I think I was hoping I'd spot her, maybe tomorrow at the arrivals hall or later in the market crowd, wearing the same green scarf and bug-eyed sunglasses, my surgical mask and salaryman suit disguised enough that I might follow her unnoticed to your rendezvous. Is it the Cafe Diamond, maybe, where you first met by the Kaminarimon? Or why not your apartment crowded with novels, your translations of Mishima and Kawabata and Abe, all your Japanese books, every one a translation that gives you away as one of us, a gaijin after all? Wasn't it you that wrote, you are destined to meet yourself waiting for the traveler? You fraud. Wasn't it you that turned me on? So I'll leave that there. Again, this is, I wish I could see you, but I'm going to end, as I mentioned, with a short piece from a new project that I've been working on. It's a new project, but it's a project that I've been sort of struggling with for years now. And it really sort of started off after my father's passing, his mother's passing, my grandmother, as a kind of investigation in my family story of immigration from Mexico and from Tequila, town of Tequila outside of Jalisco. And in the years since, really got thinking more and more about sort of the process of migration. And so it's now become a project that intertwines sort of three stories: that family story, as I mentioned, the story of Gonzalo Mejia, who was a real person. He was the treasurer on Cortez's expedition and the conquest of Mexico. And I claim him as the first Mejia in Mexico. And so his journey to Tenochtitlan, and then also the journey of Central American migrants that we're more familiar with now across Mexico to the US-Mexico border. So this section is called In Ruins, and it's me trying to imagine the story of my grandmother's cousin, who was the first of us to come over in 1919, winter of 1919, at El Paso. And these kind of stories, sort of that long, hard journey, it's quite a ways, are often the things that get lost, the things that people seem to not want to talk about, like that, they talk about the arrival, but that space in between, which I think of as a kind of transition to the new place, is what I'm after here. So this is just a little section of that. It was a town of starving dogs, a pueblo of pigs and sick cows, a miserable flock of geese, circling buzzards, a town of clouds, engulfed in fog, voices of the terrified citizens, children and women calling to each other across the plaza, names of lost family or warnings barely intelligible, on the verge of panic, as if they can't hear each other. There's nothing to hear. Approaching from behind, receding on your right, your left, into the dark, narrow space between walls. Fewer and fewer of them now. The village has wandered off to find those people, leaving nothing behind, no stone or shattered stump, no fields. The village has been swallowed by sand, buried beneath a heap of Dezontle, startled loose from the ridge. A town of smoke, in flames, gone. Blown to pieces by cannons, pulled down by men on horseback, tipped into a dry gorge by a strong wind, torn apart by widows in a rage. Empty, covered in blood, left whimpering in the dust. It's thrown itself over the edge, just a pile of fractured beams down there, a sad heap of tiles and adobe, wagon wheels, shattered glass and pottery, shards of mirrors, the belly of a stove, a curved chair back, iron bed frame, one straight thing near the center of the catastrophe, a horse's leg, rising like a flagpole, a stela, marking the resting place of the dead. It howls down from the mountains, the wind, making the squat homes whistle and sing, trying the few doors that remain, flinging one open, smacking it harshly against the wall. He'd been directed here the day before, Jose, told this road would lead to a larger one heading north, that he might find someone around with a bit of food to spare, a place to sleep. He'd ignored the doubt in the other man's voice, his lack of a face. Go with God, they told each other, and parted ways. But here too, they've all already moved on, taking with them every animal worth sparing, whatever could walk or bear a burden, whatever could be eaten. All the rice, all the beans, the squash, every ear of corn, all the metates and comames, every jug of water. The one store is also empty, not a belt or a nail, not a loop of rope. The fruit from the walled orchard too, even most of what had fallen on the ground, gone. Just a few desiccated lumps left behind, picked to the pit by birds and ants. And the fruit of the nopales mounded between the homes, also gone, were left to shrivel to tiny fists. The people's milpas are a chaos of fallen stalks. They'd stayed for one final harvest, then abandoned the place, he thought, the whole community at once by mutual agreement, finally surrendering this land they'd been clinging to for generations, leaving it now to the coyotes, whose shit seemed to be everywhere, to the hummingbirds and the snakes, to men like him passing through, bandits, the wind, to the hacendado, who would eventually ink this little parcel too into his ledger, and then bring in some peons from the south to live in these homes, to begin working these few hectares back to profitability, cotton now, or wheat, or cattle. As he neared the town, he drunk from a trickle of cool, fresh water that would swell in the spring. A view of the wide, fertile valley at sunrise. It was a good place. He called out now and then as he wandered among the homes, checking for life, then making sure they were all empty, called out almost too softly for anyone to hear. He whispered. He hummed a tune he could no longer ignore. He didn't want to be heard. He wanted no answer, no host or neighbor, no trouble. The circling vultures might be enough to draw someone's attention, some sentinel watching from up near the ridge behind the village. The walls facing that side had been marked by bullets. Nothing big, rifles, pistols. Others had been blackened by fires, big and small. Someone had scrawled "Ayuda" on the bricks beside their door. Maybe the catastrophe that had driven them off had nothing to do with hunger or sickness, nothing to do with federal troops or revolutionary factions. He was sitting in the shade against a wall, facing the looted chapel, not hiding from that watcher's gaze up on the ridge. Not exactly. They'd taken the bell. Probably there was no one up there, living in a cave, camping out among the rocks and nopal and twisted juniper. There wasn't much point. This place was dead. But then that man up there would have work. Call it work, that watching. All he had to do was say he'd been seeing a few people. They could be armed men coming and going. What might they be up to? And the hacendado would supply him with food, provide the same for his wife and children somewhere, some other grouping of homes nearby, mostly empty, but still breathing. He'd seen dozens of places like this, where the war had given cover to older local conflicts, wars within the war, between these people and the boss, the Gachupin with 5 names, the hoarder of land who knew he needed to protect himself, that disorder provided opportunity for a while and that he should seize it first. Whatever had happened here seemed to have happened recently, and what happened next convinced them to leave. The mountain shadows had gotten longer, leagues and leagues across the valley. The shadow grew cold, and then the wind had begun to rise, bulling its way around corners full of stinging grit. He might have chosen a home with a door facing east, built a fire in the clay oven with the fence of a goat pen, and curled up close to it, wrapped in his blanket. There was no man up above to see the smoke, he assured himself. He had no choice but to trust, or it didn't matter. Jose was just a lizard, a snake passing through, dragging an empty stomach. He quieted himself with all he'd seen that day in order, beginning with the faceless man, how he'd gotten there, the pale rocky slopes, vistas of mixed scrubland, distant towns and ranchos, places where field work might have sustained him for a while, digging, plowing, repairing homes and fences, diversions, digressions, sticky traps for men like him, not like him, men who couldn't yet imagine themselves arriving at the border as he would eventually. He was moving, even now, his legs trembling. He was walking past small herds of cattle and farther off the green lines of trees and shrubs edging a slow waterway. He'd been resting in a hollow below the road when a group of deer picked their way down the slope beside him, quiet and careful, delicate, though their hides had grown patchy, ugly. Vultures again, turning their circles, sparrows battling a hawk, a skittering and twitching in the powder-covered brush that drew him briefly out of his trance, out of the space he'd retreated to some time ago, silent and dry and still, a kind of home, a single room he carried with him, where everyone lived, still lived, where everything had been recorded in their memories, their voices, hoarse and whispering, perpetual exchanges between this face and that one, the best and worst face at once. And following the sound of one voice or another, you might lean back for a moment and reflect, thinking, yes, that did happen. That day, climbing the volcano, the sound of axes and the sunlight filtering through the trees. But I remember it this way. Or there was someone else there too, that man, that girl. Or how could you know this, Tia? Tia? You know this, she says. We must remember, she says. But then someone else is talking, carrying you away from that day with your mother's face, with the first girl you ever touched. And you're thinking about how you learned to keep the fire burning beneath the agave and the other men who worked there in San Martin, the ones you instructed or quarreled with. And you realize just in passing that this is forgetting, this wandering, not memory, that this is a house of death. And you are not asleep, but it's hard, nearly impossible to find your way back without any recollection until the sound in the bushes. And what has happened is that you've walked a very long way into the afternoon and the winter sun is still blinding, but the road here leads down, has been leading you down past the trickle of fresh water you should stop to drink, to the abandoned village where someone had directed you, a man without a face. And further on, tomorrow, you'll find the larger town where the train will pass that will take you to the next place, and on from there, and on again until you're in another place that won't recognize you at all beyond the river, the Bravo, and you'll hear things. But you had no idea yet what the place would be like, but you knew from what you'd been told, what you'd read for yourself, that it could provide, that it would, that it would sustain you, because those who lived here were there now, and they would know you, help you, that it was known as home to them now again, and that it would be yours. It would be ours, our only ever home. And that was forgetting. And maybe also that was death. Thanks. Thanks so much for coming out. And I'll kick it over to Will again for the Q&A.
Wow, that was great. I can't wait to read that on the page.
Can't wait to be done.
I know the feeling. That's how I feel about most of my own work. Well, at this point, we've got about 10 minutes left. And so if anyone of the attendees or other panelists or anyone has any questions, you'd like to list those in the chat section, just make sure that you're addressing all panelists and attendees so that we can see what's there. You can also, there's the option of putting them in the Q&A. And of course, they don't even have to be questions. You can just have thoughts, observations, praise, whatever you want. But we'd love to hear from you. I will remind everybody again that we've got copies, of course, of Tokyo. This is the amazing cover of this book over at what's now referred to as the Shipyard, essentially our bookstore. And soon, I know, Mike, you sent me the signed book plates. They haven't arrived quite yet, but that's okay. As soon as I get them, they will go in the inside the covers of the books, and so you can purchase a signed copy. I guess, Mike, while we're waiting for some questions maybe to come in, I was just curious about what was most striking to me, I think, about that last piece was just the voice. There's something very kind of meditative, but something also, I think, about the atmosphere that felt slightly ominous, and I really like it. I mean, I thought that was really cool. I was wondering, do you have, are there authors whose voices you find that you kind of start, maybe either intentionally or not, kind of mimicking when you write like that?
Absolutely. That's a great question. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned with your class yesterday, one of my first things I started to do to sort of create the voice for Tokyo, or for Ito's report, was just reading Japanese fiction, and I mean, admittedly in translation, but trying to sort of like hear those voices and rhythms and the way that things get expressed, in different, and there are a ton of different possibilities there, but I start to gravitate towards some or other. And so this piece, taking the Mexico piece in ruins, it takes place in, the winter of 1919, and, as we all know very well right now, another pandemic year, so, and also a pandemic year coming right at the end of the armed phase of the revolution. So, Jose had actually, this is part of his legend, that, he had fought in the revolution for a period of time, probably about mid-decade, 1914, 15, or in there, which was a very sort of turbulent time, in the sense that, like, who the enemy was had become was sort of in question, right? I mean, there was when the revolution started, the idea was to topple Porfirio Diaz, and that took, about a year, to happen. And then, the various revolutionary factions started to sort of work things out amongst themselves, like who was going to sort of take control of the future, as it were. And it was a time that Jose became sort of disillusioned with things. He's, as the story goes, had it had been made known to him that it was probably better off leaving. And so this was a big inspiration for his move north. I have, as I mentioned again yesterday, I've been working for some years, going all the way back to my time at Berry, on a course that I've been developing on Latin American fiction, contemporary Latin American fiction. So, the boom is kind of like the linchpin of all that. But, I look at the precursors, and I look at the more contemporary work. And among those precursors that I'm really, really fond of is Juan Rulfo, and his novel, Pedro Paramo in particular, which is just, again, just a really unique work. Juan Rulfo was also from Jalisco state, from a small town. And, he, the time frame of that novel, Pedro Paramo, is very flexible, but it does sort of occur sometime between 1910 and sort of like this period, like the sort of the end, or sort of like early 1920s. So one of the things that I really am fond about that book is the way that he uses voices, the way that he does voices, and his effort there was to sort of capture the voices of rural Mexicans with, very simple language, very little use of like dialogue tags. And it has this sort of very uncanny feeling, which is very useful in that book because it is populated by ghosts, by a town that is dead. So, it wasn't trying to sort of like, steal too much from him, but it definitely that approach to voice, the simplicity of language, was very important for me. And sort of thinking about, rhythm has always been a thing that I've been fond of and worked with. That's also a big part of the voice there.
Oh, thank you. And it sounds like you're already kind of addressing some of this, but Joseph Brown has written and just asked, I guess in a very broad way, what was your inspiration for this piece?
Yeah. It's again, a great question, and I really appreciate it. One of the phenomena of this period of migration that really sort of exploded. There's always been, movement across the border, particularly, between northern Mexico and Texas and all along the Southwest. But there was a real explosion of that, at the beginning of the revolution. A lot of people, obviously, trying to escape the violence of the revolution. But even in the years, the 10 years before that, the Porfirian project, that the last sort of president, really sort of a dictator of Mexico before the revolution, had created a situation that was, untenable for most of the people in Mexico, ultimately, like rural Mexicans. Who were facing starvation, a real lack of adequate wages, et cetera. So there was a lot of whole communities that were emptying out. And this is still a phenomenon. It's a phenomenon in Guatemala and Honduras now, which is part of the reason why I'm interested in twining that story in. of people abandoning their their home, their land, and not just founding these large communities along the border and much deeper into the US and Chicago and New York, et cetera, but actually sort of finding a home there, knowing that there was a place for them to transition into American life, as it were, if that was even necessary, that they could live that their entire lives in these communities. And my grandmother, once she had passed across the border, did spend some time in those border communities. And I feel like my father, who was born in rural Texas, New Mexico, I think was the last sort of generation that sort of had that experience. And so, as an inspiration, it's it's a way of thinking about what we're seeing right now. But it started really with my thinking about my story, my family story. A story that I never really knew. I never knew to ask. I've never thought to ask about. As you do, you just sort of like, I'm here now doing my thing, and trying to understand that our connection to this, and so it's really I would say that's a big part of it, and then also obviously the reading, and just sort of like thinking about those times.
Great. Let me see. Oh, here we go. It looks like Dr. Meek has just dropped the link for the survey for CE credit into the chat. And
It's so exciting for me to actually be worthy of cultural events credit, because you got to apply for it, so it's like.
Yeah, and we actually applied for this to be a cultural event about a year ago now, because we were talking to you about coming last spring.
Right.
Shut down.
In the before times.
That's right. And as I was saying in class and earlier, I really hope at some point that we can actually bring you and Mindy here to visit. And I know lots of people would love to see you both again.
Yeah. I'm so sorry I can't see y'all's faces.
Yeah. So you got a quick question from Trevor Almy. He says, "Hey, Ken, I kind of have a two-part question here. In Tokyo, in part one at least, the narratorial voice is rather reminiscent of Murakami. I agree with that. And in the humor that's created by the incongruity between the clinical report and the sensuous imagery. Were there any works of his in particular that were influential as you wrote Ito's report? And also in terms of influence, knowing how much of a cinephile you are and seeing so much filmic content in Tokyo, I am curious as to what movies were percolating in your mind as you wrote. Thanks for tonight's reading."
Thanks for that, Trevor. It's really great. I think I can't specify a single Murakami work that was inspiring me at that as I was developing that piece. I mean, I guess just sort of like the work in Toto. I feel like I was engaging with some of my other inspirations, Kafka for sure, and Poe a little bit to some extent in that particular scene that I read. I think when maybe more so, I can think about another author, Kobo Abe, that I had started reading, that I was really fascinated by. Sort of the way, again, like the mannerisms of his language, the strangeness of a book like oh god, sorry, I'm gonna turn around here to. Is it iStation 4, or it's just like that particular sort of mode of fiction writing that's sort of like speculative, but also philosophical. Like, I mean, that was really kind of what got me going, maybe more so. And the films is interesting too. I have to say I can't really point. This is so embarrassing. Like, I can't point to a specific one. Although later, as I was working on this piece, there's a film called Revenge of a Kabuki Actor that is fantastic. It's from the 1960s. It's a historical film ultimately. But that became a really important sort of touchstone for me in developing sort of the movement of the latter part of the book. I mean, and its emphasis on performance. Like I didn't explain that, you know, the character Yumiko, you know, she touches her hair and there's white powder there. It's not cocaine. It's actually, you know, the white powder that is used in kabuki, and sort of, you know, that latter part really sort of like uses kabuki as a kind of like you know, metaphor generally for performance, and that, you know, sort of the ways in which you know, sort of women are always played by men. That is just a requirement of the form. And you know, so the artificiality of that, and you know, that film Revenge of Kabuki Actor is like so amazing in its sort of moments of realism that are you know, intercut with this sort of fantastic sort of surreal shift to where sometimes you think you've moved onto a kabuki stage, and that kind of like you know, uncertainty about, you know, sort of context was something that I really wanted to cultivate in this book.
Great. Thanks so much. That's really cool. It made me something about the voice too. I think I definitely get the Murakami. Something makes me think of Kawabata a little bit. I think it's like there's a kind of quietness, you know, and like a sort of like careful or curated simplicity, you know, that's just kind of lovely there too. But
I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, Snow Country definitely, like that was a book that I read in college actually and went back to. And again, like, yeah, I mean, this is sort of the amazing quietness of that book was something that I really wanted to cultivate, you know, in several places there, sort of intercut with these sort of jarring experiences of, you know, action or surprise or sort of a trap door opening up. But he, you know, he actually has another book from earlier in his career from the 1920s about Asakusa, this like, which was like this sort of like you know, middle lower class kind of like entertainment center. You know, sort of there was, you know, the geisha quarters were not far from there, but there was like, you know, gambling and, you know, as the early cinemas were there and this stuff. And that, that novel is really fantastic. Like, just you know, again, like, you know, this like modernist kind of a collage work that when I discovered it, I was like, wow, this is, you know, this is working for me too.
that's great. Great. Well, thank you so much, Mike. I think somebody was asking, is there a link for the CE credit? It is there in the chat right now, and you can just click on that when you get a chance. Just within the next day or so, you can do it now. And once we have that list, we'll check the Zoom attendance as well, and you'll be good to go. We are out of time. We're a little bit over time, but thanks so much, Mike, for doing this. And next time it'll be face to face.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much, Will, and thanks Sandy and Clint and everybody again for coming out. You know, I feel your presence, and I really, it really means a lot to me. So thanks so much. Have a good evening. Great weekend.
Thank you. Y'all too.